It's just after 10 on a cold July night in Punta del Este. The Uruguayan resort town is quiet in the off-season. Empty beaches, shuttered restaurants, a light rain hissing against the street lamps. Inside a small apartment on Calle La Valleja, a 48-year-old English teacher is home with his new girlfriend when the intercom buzzes. A young man asks for him by name. He slips on his shoes and goes downstairs. His partner stays on the line, listening through the speaker. She hears the front door open, then a few seconds of conversation. Ordinary, friendly. Then she hears 2 gunshots, and everything goes quiet. When the police and medics arrived on the scene that night, they found Edward Vaz clinging to life. He had been shot at point-blank range in the head. 1 bullet had struck his skull, and another had lodged in the building's facade. Neighbors huddled behind police tape, watching in horror as paramedics worked urgently. Edward was still breathing, barely. He was rushed to the Maldonado hospital, but the damage was irreversible. At 10:59 p.m., doctors pronounced him dead. A father and son who lived nearby told officers they'd glimpsed 2 young men fleeing moments after the gunshots. A local man on a motorcycle even tried to follow the suspects as they sped off in a small car. But in the rainy winter dark, the trail soon went cold. Edward's death sent shockwaves through Punta del Este and the wider Maldonado department. This wasn't some anonymous victim in a criminal underworld dispute. This was a well-liked English teacher and family man. Edward Vaz Fascioli had spent years teaching at the local elementary school, helping students master a second language. He was known as patient and devoted. In his late 40s, Edward was also a father. Friends say he doted on his children, a daughter and a younger son, and remained attentive even after a difficult divorce. Since 2015, Edward had been rebuilding his life. He'd moved out of his marital home and begun a new relationship with a woman named Malvina Suarez. It was Malvina who had been in the apartment with him that night, and who had heard his final moments over the intercom. Now she was inconsolable, giving police only a tearful account of the doorbell call and the sudden gunfire. As dawn broke the next morning, detectives from the Maldonado homicide unit surveyed the crime scene. The evidence was scant. 2 spent bullets were recovered, likely from a handgun, but no shell casings, suggesting the murder weapon might have been a revolver. The killers had covered their faces, according to Malvina, leaving no clear description beyond their general build and clothing. But a crucial clue was the method, ringing the bell and pretending to know Edward's daughter. This ploy implied insider knowledge of Edward's family. Whoever planned the hit was aware that Edward had a daughter and counted on that to lure him out. Investigators began canvassing Edward's acquaintances and relatives. Did Edward have any enemies? Had he been threatened? It didn't take long for Edward's loved ones to point detectives toward a likely source of trouble. Luluki Moraes, Edward's ex-wife and the mother of his children. Their 18-year marriage had broken down over a decade earlier, and by all accounts, the split was bitter. As police delved into the family history, an alarming picture emerged. Court records showed that Edward and Luluki had been embroiled in numerous legal disputes. The department's specialized domestic violence unit had been called in more than once to mediate accusations between them. Neighbors recalled shouting matches. And critically, Edward had been preparing a major lawsuit against Luluki over money, a claim of some $1.5 million. That sum was staggering, especially in Uruguay. Investigators learned that Edward and Luluki, during their years together, had accumulated substantial assets, luxury cars, a high-rise apartment, even a lavish villa in Punta del Este's affluent Beverly Hills enclave. After their divorce in 2006, untangling this shared wealth became a nightmare. Properties changed hands in suspicious ways. One document showed that in 2016, Edward and Luluki sold their prized estate. a grand chalet whimsically named Gypsy Queen, and deposited about $1.25 million from the sale into a bank account jointly held by Edward Lulucci and a close friend of Lulucci's. Yet by 2018, Edward felt he hadn't received his fair share. He was preparing to sue his ex-wife for what he believed he was owed. In June 2015, around the time Edward left the marital home, he had also found new love with Malvina. Lulucci, for her part, had quickly taken up with someone new as well, a man named Mauro Machado, whom she began dating in 2015. The stage was set for resentment. Police quietly inquired about Lulucci Moraes' recent activities. The 46-year-old was well known in social circles, a striking woman of Romani heritage who once enjoyed a life of luxury beside Edouard. In fact, Lulucci's family was prominent in Uruguay's small Romani community. Her father was even referred to as a Gypsy King by some. During their marriage, Edouard and Lulucci had lived extravagantly. The chalet Gypsy Queen, their former home, was the talk of Punta del Este. It was rumoured that the couple had thrown elaborate parties there, some of them swingers' gatherings for an exclusive crowd. Such tales of decadence were local legend. Now, in the wake of Edward's murder, those old rumours resurfaced with a vengeance in the media. As soon as Lulucci's name leaked as a possible suspect, tabloids dubbed the investigation El Caso de la Mansión del Sexo, the Sex Mansion Murder. Behind the lurid nickname lay the reality of a family torn apart. Detectives found ample evidence of animosity. According to Edouard's relatives, he had confided that he received death threats in the years following the separation. Lulucci had at one point filed her own complaint against Edouard as well. It appeared both ex-spouses alleged harassment by the other. And then there was the explosive fight in late 2015 when Edouard finally moved out. By one account, Edouard's departure from the shared home came after a confrontation in which Lulucci's new partner, Mauro Machado, told Edouard to leave once and for all. After that, Edouard tried to keep his distance. He settled in a modest apartment in Maldonado, the one he would later be killed outside of, and focused on his new relationship and teaching. But the unresolved financial feud simmered. If Edward's planned $1.5 million lawsuit succeeded, Lulucci stood to lose a considerable fortune. Within 48 hours of the murder, investigators had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to grow very suspicious of Lulucci. On July 11, 2018, just 2 days after Edward's death, Maldonado police brought Lulucci in for questioning. Officially, it was an interview with the victim's ex-spouse, routine, in a case like this. Unofficially, detectives were watching her keenly for any crack in composure. Lulucci denied any involvement and insisted she'd been at home the night of the murder. She lived on the outskirts of Punta del Este, in a neighbourhood called Barrio Kennedy. Indeed, police logs confirm that within an hour of the shooting, patrol officers had noticed a grey Volkswagen Gol sedan parked near Lulucci's house in Barrio Kennedy, matching the description of the getaway car given by that motorcycle witness. The coincidence was hard to ignore. The car's presence so close to Lulucci's home strongly suggested a link. Investigators ran the plate number and discovered the Volkswagen belonged to Franco Gustavo Silveira, a 36-year-old local man who worked as a bricklayer and handyman. And not just anywhere, Silveira had been doing maintenance work for Lulucci at her properties. That discovery was a turning point. Confronted with evidence tying her to the suspected driver's vehicle, Lulucci's denials did little to dissuade investigators. They quietly obtained an arrest warrant. On July 17, 2018, Lulucci was formally charged as the suspected mastermind of Edouard Vaz's homicide. At the same time, police moved in to arrest Franco Silveira, the bricklayer, as a co-conspirator. The case was now public. A Maldonado judge ordered Lulucci held in preventive detention for 90 days pending trial, citing the gravity of the evidence. Silveira, the handyman, was ordered jailed for 120 days. In the charging documents presented by prosecutor Patricia Rodriguez, the outline of a chilling plot emerged. Prosecutors alleged that Lulucci Moraes had contracted 2 hitmen from Montevideo, the nation's capital, to execute her ex-husband. And she hadn't done it alone. According to the initial case theory, Luluki enlisted the help of her employee, Silvera, to find and coordinate these killers. Silvera was said to have an amigo who could find some guys for the job. The plan, as reconstructed by investigators, was both devious and brazen. In his first interrogation, Silvera chose to cooperate. The 36-year-old builder was frightened and in deep over his head. He admitted to detectives that on the evening of Sunday, July 8th, the night before the murder, Luluki had summoned him to her house under the pretext of installing a tile. It was unusual to be called in on a Sunday, especially as other workers were off that day. Silvera showed up around 9:30 p.m. and found Luluki at home in the chalet Gypsy Queen, a property which, despite having been sold to a friend in 2016, she still used often. Her boyfriend, Mauro Machado, was also there, at least initially. Partway through the evening, Mauro left the house to pick up some food for dinner. As soon as her partner was out the door, Luluki seized the moment. She took Silvera aside and confided in him the real reason she'd called him over. Lowering her voice, she begged him not to fail her. "Tomorrow 2 guys from Montevideo are coming to give my ex-husband a scare," she said. Luluki asked Silvera to help facilitate the plan. The task, she explained, was simple. On Monday night, he was to pick up 2 men at a designated spot, drive them to Edward's residence, wait while they scared him, and then ferry them back to the pickup point. She even described how he'd recognize the pair. One would be wearing a black jacket and the other light-colored trousers. The rendezvous location was between bus stops 41 and 42 along the seafront of Playa Mansa, at the western entrance to Punta del Este. Silvera told investigators that he felt caught in a bind. Luluki was not only his employer, but a friend he'd known for years. She sounded desperate. He also noted that he had often overheard Luluki's heated phone arguments with Edward during the time he'd worked at the Gypsy Queen property. From those snippets, he knew his boss had a terrible relationship with her ex-husband. Now she was pleading for his help to teach Edward a lesson. Silvera said he reluctantly agreed to do as asked, though he claimed he thought at the time it was truly only meant to be a scare, not a murder. Before he left that Sunday night, Luluki gave him further tools for the mission. From a cupboard, she produced a black and orange mobile phone box, a new prepaid Claro mobile phone. This, she said, was for him to use to coordinate with the incoming men. Silvera opened the box later and found a basic model cell phone with a fresh SIM card already installed. Along with it, wrapped discreetly in a towel inside a nylon bag, was something heavy, which Silvera would later realize was a firearm. Luluki's partner, Mauro Machado, had apparently prepared those items for him. In fact, Silvera recalled that as he was leaving, Mauro returned to the house and personally handed him the phone box and the mysterious package. The investigation was rapidly expanding beyond just the ex-wife. Silvera's statements indicated that the 47-year-old Machado was deeply involved in organizing the hit. Within days, Machado was also detained and placed under investigation. Phone records and travel logs supported Silvera's story. A week before the murder, Machado had driven from Punta del Este to Montevideo to set the plan in motion. There, Machado approached a longtime friend of his, Matias Emanuel Guarteche Vieira, a 28-year-old with some shady contacts in the capital. Prosecutors would later describe Guarteche as the logistics coordinator of the plot. Machado offered Guarteche 5,000 pesos, a sum worth only a couple $100, to help organize the killing of Edward Vaz. Guarteche accepted. His first job was to hire 2 willing trigger men. Guarteche knew exactly the sort of people to recruit, down-and-out petty criminals eager for quick cash. Barboza, the older of the 2, had a history of theft and was actually homeless in mid-2018, drifting around the city. Alberti, the younger man, was said to be living on the streets as well, and had one minor criminal record for property damage. They were desperate enough to accept a job that promised a little money. Guarteche and Machado met with Alberti and possibly Barboza in Montevideo about a week before the chosen date. They laid out the offer: travel to Maldonado, kill a man, and be paid upon return. It appears the fee was set at 3,000 pesos for Alberti, who was to act as the decoy ringing the doorbell, and 7,000 pesos for Barboza, the designated gunman. Edwar's life was sold for what amounted to only a few hundred US dollars in total. It was a paltry bounty for murder, but to two impoverished delinquents, it was temptation enough. With the hitmen secured, Machado and his friend Guarteche set about final preparations. They borrowed a car, a grey Geely compact, from one of Guarteche's cousins, to use for transporting the killers. They also needed secure communications. Lest they be traced, the conspirators opted for disposable burner phones. According to evidence later gathered, Luluki's close friend and confidant, 43-year-old Maria Leticia Giacchino, purchased 2 prepaid mobile SIM cards under false names in Montevideo. Leticia Giacchino had lived with Edward and Luluki in the past. She had resided in their home as far back as 2002. She was practically family and had even fronted for them in business transactions. Edward had put some properties in Leticia's name while disentangling assets. Investigators believed Leticia remained loyally aligned with Luluki after the divorce. Now, evidence placed Leticia at a mobile phone shop downtown, caught on security cameras buying the very SIM cards used on the night of the murder. The web of conspirators was now nearly complete. The final countdown began. On July 9th, a cold Monday, Guarteche picked up his 2 recruits in Montevideo. That afternoon, he drove Alberti and Barboza eastward toward Maldonado in the borrowed grey Geely. Barboza carried a handgun, the weapon that had been handed over in the towel-wrapped package. Before they set out, Guarteche provided a change of clothes to Alberti, a pair of light-coloured trousers and a black blazer. These matched exactly the description Luluki had given Silveira, so he could recognize the men. It was a nearly 140-kilometer journey, around 85 miles, from the capital to Punta del Este. By approximately 9 p.m., the trio arrived at the agreed meeting point on the Rambla Mansa at Parada 41, a spot at the edge of town near the shoreline. There, in the darkness, Silveira was already waiting in his Volkswagen Gol. He had parked discreetly by the beach road. Silveira stepped out into the drizzle to confer with the newcomers. As planned, Guarteche did not join the hit team. He stayed back with the Geely, acting as a second getaway vehicle driver and reserve. Silveira quickly distributed the tools for the job. He handed Alberti and Barboza the 2 preloaded burner phones, one for them, one for him, and passed over the concealed firearm. With that, the final phase was underway. Alberti and Barboza climbed into Silveira's Volkswagen, and the local man drove them toward Edward's address, a few miles away in the city of Maldonado. Shortly before 10 p.m., Silveira's car rolled up to Edward Vaz's apartment building on Calle La Valleja. The street was quiet and poorly lit. Silveira pulled to a stop a short distance away and kept the engine idling. Alberti and Barboza got out and walked up to the front door of the small building, known as Edificio Mavaro. They wore caps or hoods low over their faces and gloves to avoid leaving prints. Inside apartment 001, Edward and Malvina were winding down for the night. Malvina later recounted that the intercom buzz startled them. It was unusual to get a caller so late. She answered through the intercom speaker. Alberti, disguising his voice, introduced himself as an acquaintance of Edward's daughter and asked if he could speak with Edward. Malvina, perplexed but not alarmed, relayed the message to Edward. Perhaps imagining one of his daughter's friends needed help or had something to deliver, Edward slipped on some shoes and headed downstairs. Malvina stayed on the line, listening quietly through the intercom to make sure everything was all right. In the foyer, Edward opened the front door to the street. Alberti greeted him with a friendly pretense. It was all a ploy to get Edward to step fully outside. As Edward inclined forward, Barboza raised the gun. Without hesitation, he fired 2 shots at Edward. The first bullet smashed into Edward's skull at close range, fatally wounding him. A second shot went wide, shattering a glass pane by the doorway. Upstairs, Malvina heard the abrupt end of conversation followed by explosive cracks. She shouted Edward's name through the intercom. There was no response beyond a faint commotion. Outside, Edward collapsed instantly, face down on the cold pavement. Alberti and Barboza sprinted back to Silveira's waiting car. A passing witness saw 2 figures scramble into the Volkswagen and speed off. By awful chance, Edward's teenage son had just arrived on a motorcycle to visit his father, only to see two strangers dash from the doorway and leap into a car. The boy cried out in horror and tried to pursue them on his motorbike as they disappeared into the night. Another neighbour, alarmed by the gunfire, also gave chase briefly. But Silvera knew the back roads. The little VW lost its pursuers within minutes. Silvera drove straight back to the Parada 41 rendezvous point. There, Matias Guarteche was waiting anxiously with the grey Geely. The handoff was swift. Barbosa and Alberti jumped out of Silvera's car and into Guarteche's. Their mission was complete. Silvera briefly watched the Geely fade into the darkness on the highway back toward Montevideo. Then he set about destroying evidence. As he navigated toward the edge of town, Silvera hurled the burner phone he'd been using, and its packaging, out the window along a deserted stretch of coastal road. To this day, the firearm used to kill Edward Vaz has never been found. Back in Montevideo in the early hours of July 10th, Guarteche delivered on the final piece of his assignment. He and the hitmen arrived safely at his residence. Guarteche paid Alberti and Barbosa in cash for the work accomplished. It was a meagre payoff, but the two men pocketed the money and went their separate ways. By sunrise, Guarteche and the masterminds in Punta del Este were confident they had gotten away with the perfect crime. They had left no traces, as they thought: anonymous hitmen, unregistered phones, and a victim whose death looked like a puzzling outlier. But in truth, the conspiracy was already unraveling. The quick police response and a bit of luck had put investigators onto the getaway car within hours. The arrest of Silvera and Luluki was just the beginning. Over the weeks that followed, detectives methodically picked apart the rest of the plot. Silvera's initial confession pointing to Luluki set the gears in motion. Interestingly, Silvera did something curious. After implicating Luluki as the one who ordered the hit, he changed his story and claimed it was actually Luluki's partner, Mauro Machado, who had recruited him to drive the men. This shift in his testimony raised eyebrows. Was Silvera trying to shield Luluki out of loyalty or fear? Or was he clarifying that Machado directly handled him? Either way, prosecutors took note. Likely both Luluki and Mauro were behind this. Meanwhile, surveillance cameras from the Ministry of Interior's Unified Command Center yielded invaluable footage. Street cameras had tracked Luluki's movements on the night of July 8th, when she met with Silvera. Video confirmed that on that Sunday, Luluki's car traveled from her home to the food pickup where Machado went, and back, clearly capturing the rendezvous where she spoke furtively with Silvera in her driveway. Cameras also recorded Silvera's Volkswagen on July 9th shuttling around the city at key times, and significantly, one camera feed showed Leticia Giacchino buying the burner phones in Montevideo. This digital evidence was pure gold for the prosecution. By early August 2018, police had enough to arrest Leticia Giacchino as an accomplice in the murder. Luluki's longtime friend was in shock at being dragged into a homicide case, but the video of her at the phone shop was hard to explain away. She maintained she'd simply run an errand at a friend's request, not knowing it was criminal. Nonetheless, Leticia was charged and held in pre-trial detention like the others. One name still eluded the investigators: Matias Guarteche, the Montevideo fixer who had recruited the killers. Silvera's testimony hadn't initially identified Guarteche by name. Since Silvera had never met him directly, he only dealt with the two hitmen and possibly Machado. But as the pieces came together, Luluki's circle of conspirators was nearly complete, missing only the capital connection mentioned obliquely by Silvera. Through a combination of phone record analysis and Machado's own slips under questioning, authorities zeroed in on Guarteche. By late 2018, an arrest warrant was out for him. Guarteche went to ground. Months passed. During this time, the case became a media sensation for Uruguay. Details of the sicariato, contract killing, and salacious tidbits about Luluki's past leaked out. The murder of Edward Vaz, an otherwise ordinary teacher, had exposed a soap opera of wealth, sex, and betrayal. Even Argentina's press picked up the story, transfixed by the tale of the Gypsy Queen of Punta del Este and her alleged sex mansion. Luluki Moraes, once a figure in elite social circles, was now behind bars and pilloried in the news. Every aspect of her life was dissected. Newspapers reported that she was the daughter of a Romani clan leader and had links to politicians and celebrities in the region. They splashed her glamorous photos alongside lurid headlines. Rumors swirled that years earlier she had hosted swingers orgies at Chalet Gypsy Queen. For months, Luluki refused to speak publicly, stewing in silence as her reputation was demolished and accusations mounted. Within the walls of the women's prison, Luluki's world was crumbling. In March 2019, after about 8 months locked up, she finally broke her silence in dramatic fashion. At a procedural hearing that month, Luluki unexpectedly raised her hand and asked to address the court. She proclaimed her innocence and then made a startling allegation. She claimed that her own boyfriend, Mauro Machado, now her co-defendant, had threatened to have her killed. According to Luluki, just days earlier, while they were being transported together in a police van, Machado had leaned toward her, chuckled, and whispered, "You're next, and your daughter and grandbaby too." Luluki was visibly shaken as she recounted this in open court. The judge immediately ordered her placed in protective solitary custody for her safety, since officials considered the possibility that Machado could indeed pay someone to harm her in jail. Luluki misinterpreted the isolation as punitive, however, and launched a brief hunger strike in protest. She even alleged mistreatment by prison guards. At one point, she reported that a guard had taunted her with an anti-Romani slur, saying she should have been made into soap, a cruel Holocaust reference. Despite these turbulent developments, Luluki finally decided to tell her side of the story. She granted a prison interview to a journalist, her first time speaking on the case. In that March 2019 interview, Luluki vehemently denied orchestrating Edwar's murder. She cast herself as a victim, claiming Machado had manipulated events and now wanted her silenced. Her defense team similarly went on the offensive in public. Luluki's attorney, Victor Della Valle, argued that the prosecution's theory made no sense. Vaz had formed another partner. There was no economic or sentimental motive for Luluki to kill him, the lawyer insisted. He portrayed Edward, not Luluki, as the villain. In an astonishing statement to the press, Della Valle labelled Edward Vaz, "always a pimp who lived off Luluki. He worked at a school until they fired him for absences." The attorney claimed that Edward had exploited Luluki and her friend Letitia for years, that these two women were exploited from the first minute by him. The defense argued that Edward had already gotten assets in the divorce. A car, an apartment, and cash, none of which he really deserved, as Della Valle put it bluntly. If anything, they implied Edward had been the aggressor, even accusing him, without evidence in court, of once assaulting their daughter. Luluki's team flatly rejected the prosecution's narrative of greed and vengeance. They maintained that after Edward moved out in 2015, things had calmed down between him and Luluki, and that there was absolute tranquility in their last year and a half. Why, they asked, would Luluki risk everything to kill him now? The prosecutors, of course, had answers. They countered with evidence of the still unresolved financial entanglements and Edward's pending $1.5 million claim. They reminded the court that Edward Vaz had been receiving death threats in the period leading up to his murder, threats that Edward himself had formally reported. And crucially, they had the testimonies and phone records linking Luluki and her inner circle to the hired killers. As pre-trial proceedings ground on, more evidence trickled in. In July 2019, a full year after the murder, the final two fugitives were caught. Carlos Alberti and Marcelo Barbosa, the alleged hitmen, were located and indicted. It turned out neither had gotten far. In fact, the older gunman, Barbosa, had been arrested on an unrelated theft charge just a month after Edward's murder and was already sitting in jail by the time investigators identified him. The younger accomplice, Alberti, had been drifting around Montevideo. Police picked him up in mid-2019 and promptly charged him. With the hitmen in custody, prosecutors now had all 7 suspects accounted for. Uruguay had only recently reformed its criminal procedure code, and this complex case would be a test of the system. There would be a full juryless bench trial, overseen by Judge Ana Maria Guzman in Maldonado, with evidence presented in open court. Prosecutor Silvia Naup, who had taken over the case, and later Prosecutor Sebastian Robles, led the state's case. The charges were weighty, essentially first-degree murder with special aggravating factors, premeditation and killing for hire. Under Uruguayan law, that crime carries a maximum of 30 years in prison. In August 2019, Prosecutor Naup filed her final indictment and requested the maximum penalty of 30 years for each of the main defendants. Additionally, Naup asked the court to sentence Franco Silveira, who had cooperated, to 10 years as an accomplice. This indicated the prosecution viewed Silveira's role as secondary and deserving of some leniency, whereas all others, even Leticia, were painted as fully complicit in the murder plot. The decision to lump Leticia with the planners irked the defense, which argued there was no proof Leticia knew a murder was planned. But prosecutors noted the sophistication of her actions. Buying untraceable phones strongly suggested she knew the intent. The trial commenced in July 2020, 2 years after Edwar's death. Uruguay does not use juries for serious felonies, so Judge Guzman heard all evidence and would render the verdict. Over several days, the court heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and some of the accused themselves. Prosecutor Naup remarked to the court how difficult the investigation had been, in part because the suspects attempted to intimidate one another and potential witnesses. "It's very difficult to investigate when people are sowing fear everywhere," she said, referring to the crossed threats among the co-accused that had occurred. In the courtroom, these tensions were palpable. The once allied conspirators were now largely estranged, each looking out for their own interests. Luluki chose to testify in her defense. Dressed neatly and speaking with the composure of someone used to high society, she continued to deny ordering any murder. She admitted to long-standing disputes with Edward, but insisted she would never harm him. Her lawyers hammered on the lack of any direct eyewitness or smoking gun proof of her giving a kill order. Nobody names Luluki, except one person who changed his story 5 times, they argued, alluding to Silveira's shifting accounts. And as for Leticia, no one names her at all, they said, asserting Leticia had been dragged in by association. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They walked through the logic. Who else but those who stood to gain financially would want Edward dead? Edward had a new life, a new partner. He posed an obstacle only in terms of monetary claims. And the person on the other side of that financial battle was Luluki. They pointed out that the hitmen had no personal motive. They were hired hands. So one must ask, hired by whom? All evidence, they argued, pointed to Luluki and her inner circle. Throughout the trial, Edward Vaz's family members sat quietly in the gallery. His elderly mother, Teresa, and his children were there seeking justice. They had endured 2 years of character attacks against Edward by the defense. It was painful. Edward was not present to defend his own name, but the facts spoke on his behalf. By mid-August 2020, Judge Ana Maria Guzman was ready to deliver her verdict. On August 19th, the court pronounced its judgment. The verdict: guilty on all counts. Judge Guzman found that Edward Vaz's murder had indeed been a contract killing, orchestrated by his ex-wife and her accomplices. She methodically read out the sentences for each defendant. Carlos Alejandro Alberti, the doorbell decoy, was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role as co-perpetrator. Luluki Yoselan Moraes, Edward's ex-wife, received 24 years as a co-author of aggravated homicide. Mauro Machado, her partner, was likewise given 24 years as co-author. Matias Guarteche, the Montevideo organizer, also 24 years. Maria Letizia Giacchino and Franco Silveira, having been deemed accomplices rather than principal co-authors, were each sentenced to 8 years in prison. The judge noted that these sentences took into account some mitigating factors. Luluki, Machado, and Guarteche were first-time offenders, as was Leticia, which slightly tempered their punishment. By law, the maximum of 30 years was reserved for the worst cases, and while the prosecution had sought it, the judge exercised discretion. With those pronouncements, 6 people were definitively condemned for the murder of Edouard Vaz. However, one man remained conspicuously unsentenced: Marcelo Barbosa, the gunman who had fired the fatal shot. Barbosa's case had been severed from the main trial because his indictment came later and his defense had pursued separate motions. But he would not escape justice for long. In May 2022, the Maldonado court finally tried and convicted Marcelo Barbosa, then 42 years old, as the material author of Edouard's assassination. He was given the maximum penalty, 30 years in prison. With Barbosa's sentencing, the case of Edouard Vaz's murder was essentially closed. In total, 7 conspirators were now behind bars for their parts in the killing. Uruguay's Supreme Court of Justice upheld all the convictions in 2022, rejecting the appeals various defense lawyers had filed. In the years since the verdict, there have been a few epilogues to this sad saga. In 2025, a Uruguayan family court ruled that Luluki Morais and Leticia Giacchino must pay financial damages to Edouard Vaz's surviving family, his mother and his son. The court recognized the emotional and economic suffering inflicted on Edouard's dependents by the loss of his life, and it ordered the 2 women, as the wealthier of the culprits, to compensate them. It's unclear how much was awarded, or if any payments will ever be made, given Luluki is imprisoned. Still, the judgment was symbolically important. It was a civil acknowledgement of wrongdoing on top of the criminal one, and a somber testament that, in the end, murder for hire can never truly pay. Thanks so much for listening. If you're interested in rarely heard solved global murder cases, consider giving us a follow. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we'd be thrilled if you would give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. It really helps us a lot. See you next time.